It's time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Streaming, a Decoding TV podcast. I'm David Chen, and I'm going to be replaced by Bruce Greenwood halfway through this podcast episode. Joining me today is Sarah Marrs.
I'm Sarah Marrs, and I would love to be haunted by Carla Gugino.
On today's episode of the podcast, each week, This Week in Streaming, we'll cover a show that's new and interesting in the world of streaming. We'll tell you if it's worth watching, and if it is, we'll review and spoil and discuss the entire season of the show. Today, we are discussing Mike Flanagan's The Fall of the House of Usher, new 8-part miniseries available right now on Netflix. All episodes are available. We have watched all episodes. What we're going to do here today on Decoding TV is we're going to start today by talking about our overall thoughts on the show. And we'll do that in a non-spoilery fashion. You can find more episodes of this podcast at podcast.decodingtv.com. Email us at decodingtv@gmail.com. And find us across all platforms at Decoding TV. We're on YouTube, Instagram, Threads, and so forth. So I do want to address the fact that typically on This Week in Streaming, we cover like the first episode or the first few episodes of the show, and then later on we cover the whole show. I did consider doing that, but as I started watching The Fall of the House of Usher, it just became clear that it would just make more sense to do it this way. You just watch the whole thing, talk about overall thoughts, and then talk about, spoil everything, because it really does feel like a whole unit. Right, Sarah Marrs, don't you think this is like an 8-hour movie, as they might say?
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. I think Mike Flanagan is really good at this. I think this is one of his talents as a writer, particularly when he writes for episodic television, is people will talk about prestige drama series as like it's an 8-hour movie, and it never is. It's 8 hours of television, but Mike Flanagan does have a way of making his stories like these are definitely episodes. There are arcs contained within each of the 8 episodes. It is episodic, and yet the way it's paced, the way it's edited, with there's flashbacks, there's kind of cross-cutting stories of the different siblings, the way it's edited, the way it's paced, the story elements that are parceled out in each episode, it really moves like an 8-hour movie.
Yeah.
It's a cognitive dissonance to me because it is an episodic show, and yet it feels like a very cohesive, like I plowed through all 8 episodes.
Yeah.
And didn't feel it. Didn't feel like I had just sat there and watched 7 hours and whatever minutes of TV. Like it felt like it moved really fast.
I got through all 8 hours in like 3 to 4 days. So, I would agree. And by the way, the notion of a TV show as an 8-hour movie or a 10-hour movie has often been used in a pejorative fashion these days, right? Like people say it because essentially using it in a negative way is saying, hey, you don't know how to structure an episode of TV. You're just basically, there's no discipline. We're just making an 8-hour long film and we're just arbitrarily chopping it up into like 8 distinct units. But I agree with you that what Flanagan is great at doing is he's able to achieve both. I think it is episodic television. Each episode is a self-contained thing, and yet they all go towards telling this broader story. That is one area where I think The Fall of the House of Usher really succeeds.
And as TV has become more the home of character-driven storytelling, it was like, oh, it's an 8-hour movie was also kind of used as this would have been a movie 20 years ago. And now it's a 6-part, 8-part TV show because these movies don't get made anymore.
As you said, I think it's something Mike Flanagan excels at. He is making episodic TV, but he's also making something that is a cohesive whole. So
he just seems to have a good instinct, and it starts at the writing level of how to parcel information.
Yeah.
So that you have both an episodic contained arc for that particular episode and the larger narrative that is playing out over the course of the 8 episodes of this, or Midnight Mass. I thought Midnight Mass did the same kind of storytelling very well, where it's episodes, but it still feels like a bigger story that, again, moves really fast.
Sarah Marrs, let's get into it. Let's talk about The Fall of the House of Usher. We are going to talk with no spoilers for what happens, but I am going to reveal the premise of the show and kind of the mechanics of how the show works. In The Fall of the House of Usher, Mike Flanagan is back with another gothic horror series, this time adapting some of the most famous works of Edgar Allan Poe. The fall of the House of Usher reunites Flanagan with many of the actors who have starred in his series and films over the years, starting with Gerald's game pair, Bruce Greenwood and Carla Gugino, as a billionaire and the mysterious woman haunting him, respectively. Each episode adapts a different Poe short story in an interconnected narrative about the downfall of the family behind a corrupt pharmaceutical company and their opioid disaster drug called Ligadone. As the Ushers meet increasingly fraught fates, we're forced to ask if it's karma or if the Usher family really is cursed. So, without talking about any specific things that happen in the show, other than that, Sarah Marrs, what did you think overall of the fall of the House of Usher?
I mostly liked it. I have to admit my expectations were very high because I have really enjoyed Mike Flanagan's work in the past, both
Are
his
you are
film.
you a fan of Edgar Allan Poe? Are you a Poe head?
Oh yes,
Sarah Marrs, as am I. I'm a
from
huge fan of Poe.
way
Yeah,
back,
huge
from
fan of
way
Poe.
back.
Like, Poe was assigned in school, and then I would go buy like the complete works and like read
Yeah,
Poe in my
yeah.
spare time. So huge fan of
I
Edgar Allan Poe.
I have read the complete works, including all of his shitty poetry.
You're not
Spooky.
implying that all of his poetry is bad. You're saying that some of his poems are bad, and you've read them,
Some of
right?
his poems
Yeah.
are really bad. In general, his poetry is terrible. Some of it is really
Wow.
bad because he was writing it to get paid. It
Hmm.
was he got paid per word. He would crank out a poem. It's nonsense. It's bad. He was a much better narrative writer than he was a
Hmm.
poet. I do think the value. I had this conversation with an actual poet laureate once who was like really down on Poe's poetry, and my defense of Poe's poetry is it's not good. And I do think there are moments in the House of Usher where people are quoting from the poems, and you're just like, oh, this is not good. But it's very accessible if you are either a child who maybe your first exposure to poetry is perhaps Poe. For me, I found a book in my dad's library that was the illustrated Edgar Allan Poe that included The Raven and Annabel Lee, but also City by the Sea, The Spirits of the Dead, and Ligeia. Um, those were some of the first poems I ever read. And for kids, they're really accessible. Is he William Blake? No. I would say Poe is actually probably closer to Shel Silverstein, where it's very rhymy, it's easy to memorize, it's catchy. And so, again, if you're young and that's your first exposure to poetry, you're probably going to like it because the rhyming is instinctively pleasing. And then
Hmm.
even if you're an adult, if you're older, if you're not somebody who reads poetry, if you maybe feel intimidated by poetry, if poetry feels inaccessible, Poe can be a really good place to start because, again, the threshold for entry with him is pretty low.
All right, so you're not a fan of Poe's poetry. We'll just agree to disagree on that. But you're a bigger fan of his narrative stuff. What did you think of the
Yes.
show?
I generally really liked it. It's not Midnight Mass. I was like after Midnight Mass, I'm just like I don't know if I expected him to top it, but I was like it's not Midnight Mass, but I do think there's a lot of really fun stuff in it. Especially this time of year, it is October, it is spooky season, we're 2 weeks away from Halloween. There are some amazing not only Poe references, but there's like Vincent Price stuff in the House of Usher that it was fun. And I was like, this is really like, he knows what he's doing. He's having fun. I thought the acting was great. The performances are really, really good. It looks amazing. Like really all of his shows have incredible production design. So I just didn't think it was quite as deep or cohesive. Kind of my biggest, I have two sort of main gripes, I guess, with the show, which is one, this time around, he has done the multi-generational performances before, where there's one character portrayed across decades, and there's a younger actor and an older actor and a kid actor, and we see these same people throughout the years. That has worked to tremendous effect in shows like The Haunting of Hill House in particular, where there are the kids and the adults, a little bit in Bly Manor, and to an extent in Midnight Mass. There's a little bit of sort of people aging and that all happening. In this one, I didn't feel in some of the key performances that there was a connect between the younger and older actors. That in a
Absolutely.
couple of critical cases, it felt like everyone was playing different characters in different shows.
So that was one of your issues, which I felt exactly the same way about that. And what was the other issue?
The other issue is okay, so the premise of the show, there's the Usher family, and they are undergoing something. Something is happening to the Ushers. is it supernatural? Is it just bad luck? At the beginning, it's like, wow, what's going on with this family? Seems bad. They are a
Seems bad. That's Sarah's review of the show.
They are a pharmaceutical billionaire empire along the lines of the Sacklers, who in real life are the family behind Purdue Pharma, which very infamously unleashed OxyContin into the world. And if you paid attention to the opioid crisis or any of the news about that over the last literal 2 decades, there have been memos, there have been emails revealed in various lawsuits. The Sacklers, who hold executive positions in their company, who are on the board of that company, they are in positions of power. They are not innocent bystanders. They knew oxycodone was dangerous. They knew it was addictive. They knew that their marketing was misleading when they said it was non-addictive, when they promised that it was a silver bullet for chronic pain. They knew it was none of those things. They put it on market anyway. And what is it, like 50 something thousand people have died from opioid overdoses since? Like it's terrible and it's enraging. And it was legally ruled in court that they cannot be sued or held responsible for deaths resulting from OxyContin overdose. There will be no justice in the real world. And this whole setup of the fall of the House of Usher, as much as it is an adaptation of Poe, really feels like Mike Flanagan was just infuriated, as many people were, by the fact that the Sacklers will never face real justice. And the Ushers are, let's call it fictional street justice.
I mean, yes, I think it's not a spoiler to say terrible things happen. It's called The Fall of the House of Usher. So, like, terrible things happen to them. And you're saying that it feels like he's using these fictional characters as a way to
as a stand-in for this catharsis.
To cathartically, yes.
Yeah.
But there is some value in that.
I do feel like I understand where Mike Flanagan's coming from in terms of, like, I feel this anger. There will be no justice. Let me imagine killing these people in just increasingly awful and fantastic ways. I totally get it. I don't think that fits Edgar Allan Poe particularly well. I think there's just a little bit of a mishmash that isn't quite cohesive. It isn't quite sitting together because, again, so much of Poe's work is about the self. He gets into some of the stuff about hubris and regret. That's in there. It's in the mix. But so much of Poe's work is just about the self. How well do you know yourself? What is yourself? And when do you cross a line where you no longer recognize yourself? And so many of Poe's characters do these terrible things. And it's like they are doing them from a perspective of outside of their self, of not even understanding necessarily why they're doing something.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea of using a horror gothic show to tell a story of imagined cathartic justice on a family like the Sacklers, I think these are two separate things. I think there's the adaptation of Poe, and then there's this thing about the Ushers as a stand-in for the Sacklers, and that it probably should have been two different series.
I don't even know if it'd be accurate to say this is an adaptation of Poe, right? Like, it feels a lot more like it's inspired by Poe than
I think a couple of the episodes are pretty good.
Yeah, like pretty close adaptations, but like others are not, right?
Right.
I want to begin by saying I think this miniseries is hugely ambitious. And I think Mike Flanagan is taking some big swings here. And it's actually like, I'm astonished that it works as well as it does in many ways. Because, you know, what he has done is he's taken like one story, The Fall of the House of Usher, he's made it the overarching story, moved it to modern day, taken a bunch of different Poe stories, and done like mini adaptations of each one, all of which need to like fit in with the broader narrative, also be modernized, and also deliver on horror thrills. Like that is the brief that he gave himself for this show. And I think for the most part, he achieves it. I think it is a very it goes down easy. It's a breezy show to watch, assuming you kind of like these the brand of horror that Mike Flanagan is selling. So I had a pretty good time with most of the show. I think that, on the Filmcast podcast, I compared it to Seven, the David Fincher movie where when you're watching the movie Seven, right? I think Seven is one of the great crime films of all time. There is a perverse curiosity in wanting to know how John Doe is going to kill all these different people for their sins. You're like, okay, like, so he fed this guy until he was bursting and then, kicked his stomach and caused him to burst. Like, okay, that's one of the most awful things I've ever heard. What's the next one? Like your brain is kind of like, I kind of am curious what the next one's going to be. Similar dynamic here, where there is this perverse curiosity, this morbid curiosity of, oh, I kind of want to know how he adapts like the murders of the Rue Morgue
Yeah.
and uses it to kill one of the people in the show. Like there is this hook that like really keeps you coming back and keeps you like wanting to know how this all ends. And a lot of the horror sequences are well done. As you indicated, I think the show looks great. And it's well directed. The cast is awesome. Very talented actors here. My big problem with this show is I think tonally it is a mess. I think that there are some actors who don't even appear to be acting in the same, not even show, same type of show. Like some of the performances verge on camp, if not like it left me questioning, is it supposed to be camp? Like, is it supposed to be
Well, you can't
campy,
you can't intentionally be camp.
Right, sure. But okay, fair enough. But maybe they were trying for it, right?
I would use
And
the word schlock.
yeah,
I
sure.
think there's a lot of schlock, and it does veer into camp.
Yeah.
But I think some of the actors got the script and understood it to be schlocky, and that's what they were
Right.
playing. And then some of them were like, this is intense, serious drama, and that's what they're
Exactly.
playing. And those
Exactly.
things do not fit.
It felt like half of these actors are in a different show than the other half, and that was a real problem. The show is really earnest, As you said, you have characters reciting poetry into the screen, into the camera, right? And it's like we're just gonna pose language. We're just gonna put it out there front and center, and not many shows dare do that. Wes Anderson with Roald Dahl recently did that for his Henry Sugar shorts on Netflix, and it's like a similar. It's like very earnest. It's like, hey, we love this language. We're gonna share it with you in its original form. Like that's it's rare to see a show that does that. But yeah, tonally, I think it's not great. I at various times I didn't really understand kind of what feel the show was going for, and also I do think Flanagan's reach exceeds his grasp occasionally. Like there was one or two too many subplots in this show. Not every single subplot paid off in a satisfying way, right? So it's messy, it's rough around the edges, but it's also hugely ambitious, and I think he gets the job done. At the end of the day, I feel good recommending this, but this is one of the least favorite things that Mike Flanagan has made one of my least favorite things Mike Flanagan has made.
It's probably middle of the road for me. I think
Mhm.
Midnight Mass was worse.
You thought Midnight Mass was
Oh,
worse
not
than
Midnight Mass.
this?
I'm sorry, Midnight Club.
Yeah,
Midnight Club.
Yes,
Midnight
okay.
Mass is the pinnacle.
Yeah, I think we all think Midnight Mass is a masterpiece. Like it's one of my favorite things I've ever watched.
Yeah,
Yes.
Midnight Mass is amazing. Midnight Club, the Christopher Pike adaptation, which
Yeah.
actually I thought had very similar problems to Fall of the House of Usher. In terms of the performances are kind of all over the place. The tone is kind of all over the place. I have heard this from people who worked on other series around 2021, late 2020, 2021, 2022, when people were kind of still having to bubble and work under very kind of complicated conditions in which Usher was made. They were one of the productions that had to stop and resume. And they had other problems going on too. Like they just faced a lot of problems.
They had to fire their lead actor,
and that might be why some of the performances aren't meshing.
Right, they don't match. It's like what maybe they came back after some time and decided we're going to go a different way with this.
Well, if you had a performance that a character only crosses paths, some of the actors, the characters are fairly isolated from each other by the story. And if your character only crosses paths with Bruce Greenwood playing Roderick Usher, the patriarch of the family, which was originally Frank Langella, who was fired halfway through production, They went back and refilmed the Langella scenes with Bruce Greenwood, who is one of the people who I thought read the script and went, schlock, Vincent Price, got it, okay. I think there's a really good chance some of these performances, some of what we're seeing was calibrated to whatever Frank Langella was doing, and Bruce Greenwood came in with a different take. That is a huge creative upheaval to go through mid-production.
Yes.
That I feel like there would probably be some dissonance. And also just being shut down for months. That's hard.
Exactly.
And then the conditions when they come back were hard. There's just a lot.
So logistical difficulties may have contributed to the final product, as always. Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.